that tree. There we go. And then how we can make better decisions that incorporate some of that science into our management. So I really do focus on climate change, carbon, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about today, and how you can think about the role that forests play in the carbon cycle, forest health, other topics like that. So UVM Extension Forestry, all land grant universities, institutions have extension. It's a really cool, it's part of these land grant institutions that was really delivering science to folks that needed it, right? So thinking about farmers also own forest land. So there was agricultural extension and forestry extension. And so that's really the idea, is being this like direct pipeline to help folks understand science and research, also do applied research to help inform people's decision making. So I do quite a bit of research, data analysis, things like that, to help us understand our forests here in Vermont or in the region, and help hopefully people make informed decisions with the current state of the knowledge. I work with lots of different types of folks, landowners, conservation commissions, professionals like foresters and loggers. This is a photo of me talking to a group of sugar makers. I work a lot with sugar bush folks about resilience of maple, right? Thinking about how we can incorporate climate change and carbon, forest health into sugar bush management. So I am interested, because I never know what crowd I'm gonna get at these talks, like why, if people want to share, and if folks online, if you're able to put it in the chat if you want to, but I'd just be curious if anybody wants to share, like, is there something you were hoping to learn? Why did you come out on Tuesday night, you know, in October, when it's dark out? Maybe it was for the treats. That's totally a valid reason to be here. But I'm curious if anybody would like to share, like, why'd you come? Is there something you wanted to learn? Because hopefully address it, or at least talk about it. Yes.
The chair of our Conservation Commission said you did a great job explaining forest carbon.
Oh,
So she recommended this talk.
lovely. I hope I do a good job today. It's high bar.
Not to put you on.
Yeah, exactly.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Nancy told us about it.
Okay. Very
And
pretty
we
face.
didn't know what it is.
Okay,
So I'm just curious because it's something I don't know about.
awesome. That's great.
He said not to say we. I don't speak for him.
The royal we. Yes.
I'm interested with Jacob, you know, what role old growth forests hold carbon storage, because it seems like I'm always seeing different.
So yeah. And
Just you know, you hear about the young trees, the smaller trees absorbing more carbon, the old growth storing more, all these things, and you hear so many different approaches to it. You know, what is the best way to take care of our forests is always going on in my head.
Yeah.
And then on the other end, I'm a retired builder, but I'm always trying to build more green. And I built log homes for a long time, mostly because I felt like they were the greenest and the best way to store carbon and have the least embodied energy in a construction project. So this stuff is always spinning around in my head. What's the best way?
Yeah. Anybody else? Nancy just got to all of you to go in.
These guys do a lot of work in Newbury and Tucker Mountain Town Forest, which is a small, 600 acres, mostly forested. So I'm just here to think about, we're always thinking about forest plan, and so let's see what these ideas of carbon storing will fit into the forest management plan.
Absolutely. That's great.
Somebody in the chat said they heard about it in a general ecology class. And
Oh, cool. Awesome.
We couldn't hear what she said. You mind repeating that?
Yeah, somebody online, Grace, said that she heard about it in the general ecology class and wanted to start.
At what, does it say what university? Is it at, or what's place? No, okay.
LSU.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, well, thanks for being online. Thanks for being here. I might not get to all that, but I think we can tie it all in. And also I want to leave time for questions. So if there is something that I don't get to that's burning, I'm happy to discuss it because there's a lot to talk about. I always try to, cram, like I don't want to cram too much into a talk. I probably have too much, but there are a lot of nuance, right? Thinking about what's the best way to manage, how do we incorporate all these different goals we have for land. And so I am going to talk about, I will give you all some concrete things we can do. So what I'm hoping, what my goals are for this talk, right, is to talk about how forests help us mitigate climate change through the natural process that they do, which is taking in carbon dioxide from the air. And I will also talk about the other side of this, how these benefits are at risk from climate change. So it's kind of this two sides of the coin we need to think about. But I will also talk about some strategies, and hopefully they're broad enough that everyone here can find something. Even if you're not a landowner, we can think about how we're all involved in decision-making that relate to our forests. All right, so first, kind of the science behind this. How do forests help us mitigate, so reduce the effects of climate change? So I did, just to give you all something to take home if you want some light reading, I do write an article in Northern Woodlands magazine. There's also free copies back there. Such a great magazine. I don't get any royalties for saying that. I just really love the magazine. And so I wrote a series on forest carbon, then we published it in this guide free. If you want to take a few of them, take as many as you want. I have so many. And I also did another series on climate change impacts. I don't have that in a guide yet. We're working on printing it. So cool thing about trees, they take in carbon dioxide to make food, right? So this is the process of photosynthesis. Where trees take in carbon dioxide and they make carbohydrates, which is their food source, but they also make wood, branches, leaves, roots out of that carbon. And so half the dry weight of a tree is carbon dioxide that was taken out of the atmosphere. Right, so the process here is happening in the leaf, where it's the carbon that's being separated from the carbon dioxide, and the tree's actually releasing the oxygen, allowing there to be oxygen in the air for us all to breathe. So how this works in the forest is much more complex. We focus on trees a lot. That's a conversation that happens, but it's actually this really dynamic process in a forest where carbon is moving around. It's not static. I think the messaging is that carbon gets locked away in forests, and that's really far from the truth, actually. So the process here, carbon dioxide coming in these live trees, but then that carbon, when trees die, it's getting transferred. Maybe it falls to the ground and decomposes. Some of that carbon is going into the soil. When leaves fall, that carbon is falling to the ground. It decomposes. In all these processes, things are eating that carbon, right? Arthropods, fungi, bacteria, all the things that live in the woods are eating that carbon. And at each one of those stages, carbon dioxide is emitted back out naturally. So this is a process that happens. All living things, when they eat food for energy, are releasing carbon dioxide back out. So to say that it's ever locked in here is not true. It can get locked away for different amounts of time, but it's constantly being metabolized, processed, broken apart in different ways. And so all of these places that I've illustrated here are what we call carbon pools. They're different places in the forest where carbon can be stored for different amounts of time. So a couple, I like to do a little terminology because it's a little pet peeve of mine, but I hear some of these terms get mixed up a lot. So I like to level set and just provide folks with the terms. So we have, first of all, is carbon storage. And this is just the amount of carbon in something. We can actually talk about a lot of different things. We could talk about the carbon in a single tree, in an acre of forest, in all of Vermont's forests. We can also talk about the carbon in a piece of furniture or a house, right? Anything made of wood is going to contain carbon. And so I use the analogy here, that's the money in your piggy bank, in your bank account, right? So you have the amount of money right now, that's your carbon storage. Carbon sequestration is actually the process of taking that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it. So this is like deposits. So you might deposit more one week and less the next week, but as you keep depositing, your storage grows, right? So that's kind of the rate of change. But what also happens is there are carbon emissions, and I think we associate this with a negative term, thinking about greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, but there are carbon emissions naturally from forests, as I showed you. So anytime living creatures are metabolizing, they're releasing carbon dioxide. Decomposition forest fires release carbon dioxide. And so that's like withdrawals from your bank account. And so you can see that your carbon storage really depends on that balance between deposits and withdrawals, right? Just like your bank account. And so we do have another term we use for the combination is the flux, just means change. And one thing that's kind of confusing, and I don't have that many graphs in this talk, so I will walk you through any graph, but we use positive numbers to mean that there's more carbon going out to the atmosphere than there is getting stored in the forest. And we call that a carbon source. So it means that it's emitting carbon dioxide out to the atmosphere more than it's sequestering. And then negative numbers are the opposite. We call that a carbon sink. It's basically drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide. It will make more sense when I show you some figures up, but it's just a little confusing because people always want positive to be the other way around. So positive going up into the air, negative going down into the forest. All right, so I complete the forest carbon inventory for the state of Vermont. So I basically pull in all the data from the Forest Service about forest carbon across our 4.5 million acres of forest. And I do some things and put them in these graphs to help the state of Vermont and help us all kind of understand where we are and how things are changing, the importance of our forests in terms of carbon. And so what this is showing is the amount of carbon stored in our forests over time since we have data, which is since 1990. Obviously, we had forests before then, but that's when the data start. And it's in these different pools. So above ground biomass, trees above the soil. Below ground biomass are roots, dead wood, dead standing trees, logs on the forest floor. Forest floor is actually really, we often call leaf litter, and of course the soil. And so you can see what's happening is since 1990, our forests are storing more and more every year. And this accounts for timber that we're removing from the forest, firewood that we're removing from the forest. This accounts for disturbances that kill trees. Everything is accounted for in here, and we are increasing our carbon storage every year across our forests. The other thing is really interesting. Okay, well, I will show this. This is to put into context, because these numbers probably mean nothing to you, right? They're huge numbers, but it's equivalent what our forests store right now. If we lost all of our forests, say they burnt up for some reason, it's equivalent to 175 years worth of our state's annual emissions from driving cars and heating our homes and industry. So it's a huge amount of carbon stored in our forests. But the other thing I like to point out is more than half of that is in the soil. So we often talk about the trees, which is that above ground is the dark green, kind of that weird aqua is the roots, but most of the carbon in our forest is below ground. All right, so the next thing I want to show is what the change in carbon looks like from year to year. So this is the flux. So these are smaller numbers. It's basically, if we go back to the storage, it's how much that storage is changing from year to year, right? So we're seeing an increase in the amount every year. And this is what that looks like. So again, negative numbers, more sequestration. So what we're seeing here is that since 1990, we have forests that are sequestering more carbon dioxide than they're emitting. So those are negative numbers. We are seeing that that amount is becoming less over time. I'll talk about why that is. So you can see in 1990, we're way down here, bigger negative numbers. And today, with slightly smaller negative numbers, right? It's not a huge difference, but we are seeing this general trend that that amount is decreasing. What we see here is that, of course, most of this change in the storage in our forests is in the living trees. It makes sense. They are the ones photosynthesizing, pulling the carbon dioxide out of the air. And we do see some interesting changes over time in the amount of carbon flux in some of the other pools. So one of the things, you know, we can see that over time, the amount of carbon that's fluxing into the soil is decreasing. And this is a lot of why we see these changes is because of our forest age. So this is where we are at today, and I'll talk about that. Oh wait, maybe I have that on the next slide. Nope, I'm going to talk about, so a couple of reasons why I hypothesize, and this is based on research and science, understanding across a number of scientists that work on this, why we are seeing a decline in the sequestration rate, so the power of the carbon sink in Vermont. And this is similar in some other states too, New Hampshire in particular, is that what we know, and this came up question about differences in storage and sequestration by forest age. And so if you just look at the left figure, what we know is as forests age, they store more carbon. We know this. Old growth forests store more carbon than younger forests. They have bigger trees. They have more developed soils. They have more dead wood. They have trees of different sizes. It's very well known. Of course, every forest can be different, but on average, we see this increase in carbon storage as forests age. But what we do see is that the rate of sequestration can vary based on the forest age and their development, basically. And so this graph on the right is actually showing that peak sequestration for this forest is about 20 years. Actually, what we see in a lot of research is about 40 to 80 years is kind of the peak sequestration. And why this is happening is because that's when forests are rapidly growing, developing, their soils are developing, the trees are trying to compete with each other, grow tall, get space. And when trees die, they're not that big. When you have older forests, the big trees are still taking in a lot of carbon dioxide from the air, they're growing. But when a big tree dies, that's a loss of a living tree and it starts decomposing. So as soon as a tree dies, there's some decomposition happening and it changes the carbon dynamics. And so you can see kind of in that schematic in the background, right? We have like a young forest that has a lot of little trees and they're all living. As you get in older age classes, you have lots more complexity in that forest. And so that just means we have different dynamics going on. And so we do see from research we've done from old growth forests and younger forests that that sequestration rate tapers off as forests age. Does that mean that one's better than the other? No, not at all. These are just biological processes, ecological processes we see as forests develop. And so what we're seeing in Vermont is this is the age structure of our forests. So most of our forests are in this sort of narrow band of age. And, you know, to a human, you'd be like, oh, that's pretty old, 50 to 100 years old. Well, for a forest, that's really, really young. It's ecologically, you know, early age, I would say. You know, our forests, an old growth forest may have been in that location for thousands of years, right? And the trees in an old growth forest can be 500 years old, right? So having a forest that has all the trees that are only 6 years old, pretty young. And so this idea too, as our forests in Vermont age, we will continue to store more carbon, right? We see that every year our forests are storing more carbon, but that the rate will slowly decline, and we're seeing that. And so that's just a natural process that is happening. And this really is a legacy of past land use, where our sequestration here in Vermont, that large value we see, is because of past land clearing. And so this is showing, what Vermont looked like. Actually, I think this photo is from Massachusetts, from the Harvard Forest Archives, right? Most of our region and here in Vermont was cleared. Forests were cleared for agriculture, for settlements, sheep farming. And so that was a huge pulse of carbon dioxide. When those forests were cleared and, areas were burned often, and lots of material came off the land. At that time, people burned 14 cords of wood in their house, right? It's an incredible time of extraction. And that was a huge pulse of carbon dioxide that came off the land. We often filled in wetlands, right? There was a lot of other things, not just forest land, were lost. But what we see now, that when those lands were allowed to regrow as forests, they were taking in that carbon dioxide as they grew, just naturally. And so we actually had this reversal of a really big drawdown of carbon dioxide when forests regrew on these places where farms were abandoned. And we're benefiting from that today. We're still in that recovery phase, right? So if, when you have a situation, if it was all old growth forests, like here we were back in the 1700s, yes, there were younger forests where beavers caused flooding or a blowdown occurred. But you can see that it's at zero, sort of in equilibrium, right? Where some forests were recovering, others were maybe getting blown over. We have disrupted that cycle. And so we are still in this recovery phase here. And it's a pretty amazing testament. We look across our forest now, it's, 4.5 million acres of forest. Our state is 3/4 covered with forest in such a short amount of time. It's pretty remarkable. Oh, just to say here, that box is to highlight, there is some discrepancy we don't know exactly the trajectory going forward, because there are a couple other factors that play in, and one is land use. So what we're seeing here is we are now at a point, we were at this trajectory of gaining back forest land, and sometime in the 90s, late 90s, we are now losing forest cover again. We have sort of a second wave of forest loss. It's different than that first wave, which was for farms and agriculture. Now it's mostly for development. And so we're seeing that. And so it's hard to actually know how much forest land we're losing a year. And you can see these are data from the Forest Service, and they jump all over the place. But this dotted line is a linear estimate of the average, basically. And so that's about almost 6,000 acres a year in Vermont. That doesn't mean every year we're losing that, but on average, we're losing that every year. And so what happens when we lose forest land is we lose that carbon stored in that forest. You can even lose the carbon stored in the soil. Of course, site work, excavation, tilling up, putting conduit in and on driveways and all that kind of stuff does disrupt the soil. But also that land doesn't contribute to sequestration in the future years. So we call that foregone sequestration. It's basically if we lose that benefit in the future. And so, any one year, 5,000 acres out of our 4.5 million, pretty small, but I worry about the culmination. We lose 5,000 one year, another year, that adds up over time, right? So thinking about that. So what does it look like when we combine all these data? So I'll kind of walk you through this. So we have conversion, it says conversion from forest. So this here is where we've lost forest land, other land uses. We do a little bit still gain some forest land back. Sometimes there are farmland fields that folks just don't mow anymore and become forest. And so that is a very small sliver there. It kind of looks like nothing. here is the power of our forest that I already showed you, that estimate. Here, this other green bar is actually, we get quite a lot of sequestration just from our street trees or trees in people's yards. It doesn't seem like it'd be a lot. We don't have big cities here with a lot of like, city parks, but we actually get a sizable amount from all of those trees along our roads and streets and in our towns. A couple other things that we get some carbon benefits, sequestration benefits, is actually in harvested wood products. So I mentioned the forest data accounts for harvest. It basically, the way the accounting works, it assumes anything harvested from the forest is lost, is an immediate emission. But we know that if we put that wood into a durable wood product, right? So we have, veneers or cabinetry, flooring, structural material for homes or other buildings, right? That wood is going to store that carbon for as long as that material is being used. And sometimes, right, we have houses in Vermont that are hundreds of years old. They're storing that carbon for that long. It's pretty incredible. So this does get to thinking about how do we use our wood most efficiently. And this isn't to diminish, we sometimes might want wood that has shorter lifespans for firewood. We need paper and other materials like that, but thinking about ways we can store more carbon in some of those building products. So we do get quite a lot of benefit from that. We even get benefit from when that wood is no longer used and it goes into a landfill. Because landfills are basically oxygen deprived and very little decomposition happens there. So we can actually have wood stored in landfill that just sits there and stores that carbon. When we add up all of these sources and sinks, and we compare it in this gray bar is our state's greenhouse gas emissions. So this comes from the State Agency of Natural Resources. They compile fossil fuel consumption, heating, industry, all sorts of anthropogenic, human caused emissions, and that's this gray bar. If we compare all of these to that gray bar, we actually end up here. And so in other words, our forest sector, even with land use change, even with loss of forest, it accounts for about 79% of our state's emissions, which is pretty cool, pretty sizable. And so you can imagine if we can lower this gray bar, we can get to a point where we are net zero, which is something the state is looking to achieve. So I just did want to touch on, I'm talking about carbon, and I want to touch on there are other benefits that we get from forests that help us with climate change. Carbon gets a lot of attention for good reason, but I like to emphasize some of these other benefits. So importantly, trees, even in towns or around houses, but in forests, they slow down wind, so they can reduce heating and cooling costs. They lessen the impact of heavy rain events. So when rain falls through a canopy, it actually slows down and it will take longer to infiltrate the soil. Water, when it evaporates from forests, actually helps to cool the air. Leaves intercept sunlight, keep anything below them cool. Roots prevent soil erosion when we get these heavy rain events. And we also get the source of renewable, sustainable resources, right? So there's nothing as sustainable and local as wood, and that does help us think about reducing our carbon footprint, about bringing things from further away. And so, of course, close on my mind, I'm sure many of you, we've had a number of climate-related events over the last, I don't know how many years, right? And a lot of them are heavy rain events. We just came out of, well, we're still in the long-term drought as well, right? And so there's a lot of these really punctuated events that we are having to deal with, right? So crops and roads and houses and forests are also subject to these same events. And so when we think about, I work a lot thinking about how trees and forests respond to climate change, so we can think about how we can manage them and steward them better. So a couple of these potential climate change impacts, we're already seeing some of these, and they're really variable. They can hit different locations, different forest types differently. So a couple of them here are that we are expecting and to see more kind of wacky weather events, windstorms, ice loading, 98 ice storm. Are we going to see something like that again? Really wet snow events. As the climate warms, will we see kind of that wet, heavy snow that can break branches, knock down trees, cause power lines to come down? Well, we see less snow. And so one thing we know about many of our trees here in Vermont and in New England is they really like snowpack. They've adapted with a snowy winter. And you can think of the snow as an insulative blanket on the soil. And so it protects the soil from a lot of freeze-thaw cycles, right? You see that, if you live on a dirt road, has no snowpack, right? You get mud seas and you get these frost heaves. In the forest where there is a snowpack, it prevents a lot of that really dramatic freezing and thawing of the soil. And so I've done research where we've gone into the woods and actually shoveled off the snow in a forest to see what the effects are. And what happens is that roots get damaged from many of these trees. So you probably can't see it in this photo, but a lot of the roots of trees are really shallow. They have deeper roots to access water, to anchor themselves, but they have these really fine feeder roots that are accessing nutrients in the soil and water. And those are often in the only top foot or two of the soil. And so if the soil has freeze-thaw cycles, they actually get physically damaged and they break apart. The tree is, those are roots that are meant to be expendable. But we did see in this research causes growth declines the following year, on sugar maple in particular, causes sap decline. So there's a lot of implications of this because the trees needing to repair those roots and putting energy into that repair. Of course, also the snow is really important for a lot of wildlife that live in the woods. They use that area for travel and some other, and habitat. Of course, we're seeing flooding from heavy rainfall events in low-lying areas. That is causing some problems where soils are saturated. Not all trees like to be in those conditions. And so we are seeing in some places with prolonged wet conditions, like high water tables, that some trees are dying. It's not really widespread. I've gotten a few calls about, yard trees and things like that. But of course, what we're seeing in our uplands, where a lot of our forests are, is soil erosion when we get these events. And so that water wants to find the easiest way down, and it will just continue to find that channel and cause leaf litter, logs, all sorts of stuff, soil to wash downhill. Again, that can expose roots. I've even seen trees topple because there's been so much soil erosion in those events. We're seeing, like this summer, heat and drought stress, right? Leaves are dropping early. It's pretty dull foliage this year in a lot of places. That is a response to lack of water. Trees have that adaptation. For the most part, they'll be fine. I do worry about what the seedlings of smaller trees, what their survival rate will be after this drought year. Because they don't have deep root systems. They can't store as much water in their trunk and their roots because they're little. And so we might see mortality rates increase from the smaller size classes. And we might see places that were really droughty. You might see some mortality from trees too. Did the May 18th, 2023 frost event we got, actually it was a freeze event. We had a really early spring that year, and then it got down in the 20s in a lot of places. And we had incredible freezing damage. And it was really interesting because, a lot of species had already leafed out. And it was really the late species that got damaged the most because they hadn't fully leafed out. Their leaves were really little. It affected apple trees, apple orchards were really damaged. So that is one of the things that we also are concerned about, is when we have really warm spring conditions, plants get triggered to start leafing out. And then we still have these cold events like we had in 2023. The other thing we are expecting and also seeing this occur is increases in insects and diseases. So some of the insects and diseases that affect our trees are cold limited. They are really restricted by cold temperatures. So one example is hemlock woolly adelgid that affects hemlock trees. It dies when it's really cold. When we get those -20-degree nights in the winter, mortality rate of that species is really high. We unfortunately haven't had a lot of those last few years, and we've seen the survival of that species, and it's really limited to southern Vermont right now. But the concern is that it will spread north as the winters warm. And the other thing is thinking about invasive plants. So these are introduced non-native plants that, they are really good at colonizing new places and taking advantage of disturbance. And, there's a lot of evidence from research that they will be able to be more competitive in a changing climate. And so, when we think about this, it's just really important because this affects the carbon benefits that these forests prevent. I love that folks are really interested in carbon. It's like a national, international interest in forests right now. It's great. But I have to remind people a lot that if trees are stressed, if they have poor health because of insects and diseases, if they have growth declines from changing climate, if we see things like regeneration failures, it affects the future forests. If we see mortality, that all affects that carbon benefit that we're hoping to get from our forests. And so I see carbon as something we are lucky to have this benefit, but it's not a guarantee. And so this brings us to what can we do to help steward this benefit, steward forests in this challenging time? Because we need them, and how can we make sure that they are sustained on the landscape? So I have 5 actions we can do. Like I said, I hope that there's something everyone can see here. It's kind of a high level range, depending on, different people's involvement. The first, and probably the most important, I think, is keeping forests as forests. So of course, I talked about this already. We keep forests as forests, we keep that carbon where it is. We also allow that forest to help us contribute to carbon sequestration in the future. And then all the other benefits, right? That's sort of thinking about the wildlife benefits and the timber benefits and the recreation and all the other climate benefits that I mentioned. I'm also really interested in keeping connectivity, allowing species, we think of wildlife, but plants and fungi, everything needs to be able to move around as the climate change, and as we fragment the landscape more and we break it up, it makes it much harder for species to move around. I will say though, this is where we get to thoughtful land use planning, right? We need more housing. We need food. We need livelihoods, right? And so it doesn't mean that every acre, there might be decisions we make, we decide that we need to convert a forest to another use, but being very thoughtful about that and recognizing what we're losing when we do convert that forest. One thing we're seeing in this photo increasingly is solar panels. We're seeing clearing a forest for solar. And this gets into this conundrum, right? We want renewable energy. Is this the best place for solar panels? So the second step is reforesting, thinking about how can we add more trees to the landscape. So this is both letting trees naturally grow. It's our natural land cover in most places in our state and our region, or we can even actively planting new trees. We gain carbon storage. It's actually a really great benefit where we didn't have something, carbon storage, we get it. Of course, we get all the other benefits. So the wind, blocking wind, providing shade, wildlife habitat. It's not just thinking of forests, right? So yard trees, windbreaks along pastures, right? A lot of folks who are farming are thinking about trees with their cattle to provide shade as the summers are getting warm. But then that also provides these other benefits. So we can start being creative and thinking about where can we put more trees that provide additional benefits. I will say, in terms of planting, it's expensive. You need to know what you're doing. It can be difficult to find the trees that we want to plant. That just isn't, it's not something that as a region, we've done a lot of planting for climate benefits. We've usually planted for other reasons. And so it's something the nurseries are recognizing and starting, but it takes a few years to get up to speed. And it can have a high rate of failure. So thinking about deer browse, right? Deer love planted seedlings. And so sometimes we have to do things like in this photo, protect the seedling from deer browse. It does take time to see those benefits. And of course, you know, we don't want to lose something else we need. I've seen some analyses that say, oh, we can, you know, put some millions of trees in New England, but they fail to recognize that a lot of that's farmland that we also need for our food. So thinking about those important land use trade-offs. The third strategy is thinking about where we can designate as permanent reserves. And so this is a couple other terms that folks use for this: passive management as opposed to active management. So there are areas where we're going to designate, monitor, but not do timber harvesting. And another term that folks have started using recently is proforestation. It really focuses on having these types of land for the carbon benefits, though I argue there's a lot of other benefits that we get from doing this, not just carbon. And so again, we keep carbon stored in the forest. We can promote other attributes. So I think this is a great strategy. Old growth forests, right? Unique sites with unique biodiversity, rare, uncommon sites, places we think might be what we call refugia, what might be more protected from climate change. Let's protect those sites. We can monitor them, watch how they perform in the future. It's not a good fit for every forest though. And so this is where it gets really important to understanding exactly the forest conditions, its vulnerabilities, and its potential trajectory. And one thing too, there has been some folks that think we should do this very wide scale. But when we think about the carbon implications, what it does mean is that we have what we call leakage. And so leakage is this idea: if we don't harvest any more wood products here in Vermont, we're simply gonna import them from elsewhere. And so that carbon benefit we think we're having by not cutting a tree here in Vermont, we're just getting from elsewhere. And then we transport that wood further distances. It can have a lot of other implications to the environment and the people that live there, not knowing how it was harvested. And so it actually doesn't, it negates that atmospheric benefit that we were hoping to have. And so we need to be really careful about that. And then because of our land use, not every forest is going to achieve this great maximum carbon storage potential. We have so many forests that have been impacted by past land use. So example here on the left, very common, called old-field white pine. You know, these trees, it's essentially a monoculture of white pine, nothing else. These trees have very small crowns. So they don't have a lot of leaf area up there. That usually translates to pretty small root systems. So they're easily toppled in wind. And I've seen this. One windstorm comes through here, they're all down. And there is only under here, it's all bittersweet and invasive species. And so this is what I'd call a very vulnerable forest, right? One event could mean that this is not a forest much longer. And I've seen this in places where they become an invasive shrubland. And so this is a place where I'd say passive management, probably not the best option here. Got to think about getting this forest, you know, restoring some of the ecological features. How can we move this forward into the future into a better state? A couple other examples here, you know, also with invasive understories. The one on the top is a ash stand, really beautiful, threatened by emerald ash borer, an invasive insect. And these overstory trees are infested and are dying. So again, we see that there are no understory saplings to replace that overstory. It's just invasive plants. This is a floodplain forest on the Winooski in Bolton, where I live. Beautiful floodplain forest, lovely. That's all goutweed, invasive herbaceous cover. Again, no small trees, and so the future of that forest is pretty uncertain if these overstory trees die. So those are kind of extreme examples of vulnerability, but just to illustrate that this idea that leaving every forest alone is going to mean that they have these qualities that we want, namely carbon benefits, wildlife benefits, recreational benefits, that may not be true without intervention. And the other thing to point out, and I talked about this with a little bit of leakage, this is a report from Caitlin Littlefield and her colleagues, is looking at our regional wood consumption versus harvesting. And as a region, we consume more wood than we actually produce from our forests. And so this gets into this kind of equity issue, also gets into carbon issues if we're then importing wood from elsewhere. But what is happening in those places that we harvest? Is it happening in the same way that timber harvests happen here, which for the most part have forest management plans, have licensed foresters overseeing that management, right? Have regulation and that hopefully promotes sustainability and ecological principles. So the fourth tactic is what we call climate adaptive forest management. So this is basically thinking about how to incorporate climate change into forest management, recognizing we need resources. We use wood, and I would argue wood is probably the best product we have. It's really quite amazing, and we can do it sustainably. So this idea of being climate adaptive, it's the ability of people to communities, ecosystems to adjust to climate change. But we want to think about reducing vulnerability of our forests, but also our communities, and increasing resilience. So how can we make changes to withstand and recover from these challenges? So it's thinking about like using holistic practices to enhance resilience. And I will define resilience here. We think about, we want a forest to be able to recover and adapt, bounce back from these changes, right? So we know disturbances will happen, windstorms, insect outbreaks, fire, but we want it to still be a forest after that, right? So be able to recover. So have multiple species, have different ages of trees, have all of these parts of a forest that can be there in the future. And so, example here, I showed you this white pine stand. In contrast, this other conifer stand, we see trees of different species. We see trees of different sizes, right? And so a disturbance here, yeah, sure, it might, a windstorm comes in there, it might knock down some of those mature trees. There's mid-size and small trees that will easily take over that light and space in no time. And so that's a much different trajectory for carbon, but also for those other benefits that these forests provide. So what we know about resilient forests, they have certain characteristics, this isn't like you have to check off every box, but we want to see diversity. So multiple species. We know if we have a single species, that's very vulnerable. We want to see what we call complexity. You can think of this as messiness, right? So getting away from park-like, this is a little cultural. We like clean, tidy woods, but we actually want them to be messy. And we know that if old growth forests look like old growth forests, is very messy. There's dead logs on the forest floor. There are dead standing trees. There are irregular gaps in the canopy, so it's not uniform from side to side. There might be an opening over here, and it might be more dense over here, right? There's different ages of trees. There is regeneration that's successful. I've seen a lot of forests in the state. Nothing going on in the understory, right? Because of invasive species, deer browse, or other land use and legacies. We want to see that ecological processes are functioning. So, basically, if we have a rainstorm event, we want to see that doesn't cause a lot of erosion and that water runs clear after that storm, right? We want to see a little limited impact from invasive plants. We might not be able to remove all invasive plants from a parcel. That might not be possible, but we don't want to cause impacts to, say, tree regeneration and other wildlife. And we want to see that a stressor coming through doesn't just decimate a stand and mean it's no longer a forest, right? We want that forest to continue in the future. And so one term that I use, get folks to think about this idea of the forest, not just the carbon, is that we want to manage for resilient carbon. So we want carbon today, but we also want it in the future. And so that means we have to think about the future trajectory of that forest. And so I'll give you some examples from stuff folks are doing. I think these might all be in our state. Some of them might be in other states. I'll mention those. But this is in Vermont. This is in Hinesford Town Forest. Adding more deadwoods. They did a timber harvest here, right? Felling and leaving some low value wood, leaving branches and tops, what we call high, instead of running over them with equipment to kind of flatten them down. Leave it messy. Wildlife love this. This is great habitat. It also protects seedlings from deer browse. This cycles nutrients back in the soil, holds water. There's so many benefits we get from this. Another thing folks are doing is girdling trees, so intentionally creating standing dead trees. Again, this is a low value tree, not maybe worth it for harvesting. It's an American beech that was infected by beech bark disease. Girdle that tree, takes a long time for that tree to die. And what we get is these canopy gaps, right? So then light gets down to the surface of the forest floor, creates opportunities for new trees to regenerate. And those are great for carbon, great for perching for birds. Habitat, we can do things like creating canopy gaps to provide vertical structure. So we're removing trees in a group, right? And so this idea that we're creating sort of vertical different heights of trees here, so different conditions. We're creating space for new regeneration here, so light-filled gaps necessary for trees to regenerate. You get a dense diversity of species coming up in these areas. Controlling invasive plants. So, this is really important because we know that they reduce biodiversity. They're not good food source for a lot of our native birds and mammals, and they outcompete our native tree seedlings. Doing things like removing trees around a healthy, vigorous tree that we're going to leave. And so the idea here is that creating space around this tree, this white pine means that, actually it's a red oak, creates space so that tree is going to get larger. And we know that bigger trees contribute more to carbon storage, also creates opportunities for some younger trees, some smaller trees to fill that space. This idea of horizontal complexity, right? So it's different conditions here than it is out in this opening, right? So we want different things in different places, and even across, this isn't just across a parcel, but thinking about our landscape, creating less uniformity in our forests. Some folks are doing this. This is in a town forest, so they put an L on it. That doesn't necessarily need to have an L, but this idea of having legacy trees that will live out their full lifespan and be old. They provide a seed source for a new generation of tree. And so this is really important that we also have old trees in the forest along with young trees. Planting future climate adaptive species. So these are species that we think might do better in a future climate. Species like red oak, white pine, black birch. So, people are trying this. This is a research study that Tony D'Amato at UVM is doing to understand how different species are responding to these changes in climate. But this idea of incorporating some of these other species into places where they might not exist to help bolster the resilience of that forest. And the last strategy that I'm really excited about is this idea of strategic wood addition. So we're adding carbon in the form of big trees, back to streams. So we would have had a lot more wood in our streams, but we cleared them out a lot for different reasons. In some places it was to transport logs, some places it was just to tidy up the streams. So there's a lot of our streams have, really all of our streams have less wood than they would normally have had hundreds of years ago. And so folks are actually working now to add these trees back into the stream, and it provides several benefits, including for cold water fish, like trout really like the conditions created. So a lot of people that fish really like this because the fish, they've actually done studies, Fish and Wildlife Department, the fish are bigger. They have more food, right? There's more aquatic invertebrates in these waters. When we create these different conditions, from a carbon standpoint, we're adding carbon to these streams. We're also reducing the flood risk of a lot of these streams because it slows down the flow. You can actually see here is the eroded bank. So the stream bed would have been a lot higher, you know, a couple hundred years ago, but over time it's just eroded. And this is another example from Shane Jakewith. I love this because they did this, they have this natural woody dam here, and you can actually see how much higher the stream level is here than it is here. And it has a lot of carbon in there. So you get carbon, you get wildlife benefits, you get resilience. And the last strategy I just wanted to touch on is this idea, I mentioned a couple times, but this idea of how we can incorporate local wood products with our forests and how it can really be synergistic. So thinking about if you're a landowner or work on your town forest, that role of harvesting local wood products that can go into a local wood supply is really, really important. Are ways that we can purchase local wood, not always easy. You know, if you go to a big box lumber store, you often don't know where that lumber is coming from. There are some places you can, or a local sawmill. It's not that easy. So this helps us with long-term carbon storage, avoided emissions, instead of using steel, concrete, plastics, right? There's now wood fiber insulation that we can use instead of plastic insulation. Really incredible. And it's a waste product from milling. So it kind of gets this really great benefit. Not widely available too much yet, but also it supports our local community. John Erickson, who's a professor at UVM, uses this term bioregional economy, this idea of like, how can we keep our resource needs as close as possible, right? We saw this during COVID when you get these global issues, it really disrupts this global supply. And so having things local really does allow us to have a little bit more resilience in our wood supply for sure. So I think, I guess I have a sum up slide quickly. So just to sum up, right, forests can help us mitigate climate change, but really importantly to recognize they're also impacted by climate change. So I did lay out 5 broad things that we can do as a state or a region to adapt to these changing conditions. And hopefully, you know, there's things in there that you see that maybe you could consider whatever way you are able to. I will say, you know, there have been a lot of folks that have thrown out these like we have the one solution. There's no one solution. We do need this, what we call a portfolio effect or portfolio strategy, right? There's no one thing to do for all of our forests, because each forest, as I go in more and more forests, I'm blown away by how different every single forest is, because it really depends on the soils, the climate, the species, the land use that's happened there. There's so much that gets tied in. And so we do really need to make sure that everything we do is very site specific and place based in our stewardship. I just want to end. I do have a website. That's a QR code. You can also just put in your search bar UVM Extension Forestry. I have lots of resources on all sorts of different topics: carbon, climate change, biodiversity, forest management. I have lots of things back there. They also exist as digital versions on my website. So please check that out. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions if you all have any.
Trees grow better when the climate is warm, right? So will climate change, the climate getting warmer, make the trees grow more in Vermont?
Yes, should I repeat the questions for the, all right, so, the question is about, will climate change make trees, or trees growing more with climate change? Actually, they are, so I do, some studies, I do tree ring studies, dendrochronology, so basically, I have this little auger, I core into trees, and you can extract a little pencil size piece of wood that is every single ring of that tree, and every year, a tree puts on a new ring, growth ring, and you can actually look at the width of those rings. And we are seeing that for many species, they're growing better than they have in the past. And that's really because we have a longer growing season. We have our growing seasons increased by about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's just, we're in what we call a temperature limited climate. Trees start growing when it's warm enough in the spring and they stop growing, when it's cold. And so the longer that is, particularly in the spring, is really helpful for trees. And so we are seeing that. It does depend though on these other climate events we get, weather events. So a year like this year with this drought, and what happens too with trees, they aren't only responding to the weather events in the single year, they'll respond to a few years. And so this drought will affect the trees next year too, like their growth. And so I imagine that we'll see in particular locations pretty low growth. That frost event that I mentioned in 2023, actually haven't cored trees, but I set up plots and marked trees that I want to go actually take cores from and see how that frost event affected their growth, because it was at this really pivotal time when they're leafing out. Most of the trees put out a second flush of leaves, but that's an incredible energy demand. And so it's likely that we'll see decreases in growth after that. So, yeah. The first.
Just with reference to what you just said, I have heard from foresters that maples don't like heat, they like cool, moist conditions, and so they will be one tree that probably won't do better with warmer temperatures, right?
Well, it really depends. For folks online, the question is specifically about sugar maple. About yes, it is a cold loving species, although it does exist far much more south than us. So its range actually extends.
Those different genotypes.
It can. So there's a few things going on. There's local site conditions. So even on a north facing slope versus a south facing slope can be wildly different conditions. Even a really short geographic range. We can also have weather events. We can have what we call cold air drainages, where cold air just comes down into certain areas. So it's more complex than just saying oh, you go north or south or up or down. There's a lot of microsite factors. So I do feel pretty optimistic about sugar maple. I think there are going to be places where it will be stressed. Warm places, so south facing slopes. Places that are drier, it doesn't like dry conditions. So really, really sandy, well-drained soils, really low elevation locations that are just warmer. And there is a lot of genetic diversity. It's actually a really genetically diverse species. Sugar maple, it exists, really big range. And so what we see that when certain species have a lot of genetic diversity is that they have better ability to, some of the trees can have adaptations to survive conditions. So we might see, I think we're going to see a lot of local effects where certain places might be more stressed than other places. We do also have multiple maple species. Red maple, people might be familiar with it, it's soft maple, very tolerant of everything. It can grow in swamps, it can grow super dry conditions. That is a really amazing tree. And so, red maple is our most adaptable tree species that we have. And so that is a species, and we can tap it. Yeah, there actually was research in the Proctor maple. People have tapped it for a long time. Really, every maple species you can tap for sap and make syrup. Sugar maple's the best because it's high sugar content. So when we use buckets, it really makes sense now that people are doing lines and reverse osmosis. Thank you. Vacuum systems. Yes. It really makes less difference. So it produces, you need a lot more sap to produce the same amount of syrup, so it's not as high sugar content, but it produces way more sap in a year in the season than a sugar maple. So there's been research at Procter Maple Research Center, and these expert maple syrup tasters could not taste the difference between the red maple and the sugar, because we always had this thing, oh, red maple's inferior, and they could not taste the difference. And so there are a lot of sugar makers that are now doing it because red maple is very resilient to climate effects. It also is not eaten by a lot of the pests, like spongy moth, that sugar maple leaves are really, really, for whatever, there's a lot of nutrient content of sugar maple leaves. It's very nutritious for a lot of insects and caterpillars. And red maple will just be out there, full leaves, no issues, and all the sugar maples are defoliated. So it allows for resilience for these sugar bushes to have some red maple that they're tapping. And yeah, so it's one of those things to consider too.
Question.
Yes.
This year, I heard there were lots of like massive forest fires all over different parts of like Spain and Turkey. And I was wondering, like huge, vast hectares and hectares of forest are destroyed in these because they're out of control and they can't even put them out. So they have to let them burn out. And so there's vast areas of forest just burnt. And I was just wondering what kind of impact that has, and if they actually, how quickly they come back, or what happens with all that, because I don't know.
Yeah. So a question online was about forest fires. So I mean, we've been subject to it the last number of years with Canadian forest fires. And so that's up in boreal forests, it's black spruce, forests that are really deep litter layers, and the fires just smolder in that. And I've actually seen photos after the fire goes through, there'll be about 2 feet of that duff layer that's burnt, and the tree roots are just stilted above that. And so it just smolder. They couldn't put them out. There's some winters where the fires continue to smolder under the snowpack. That's how incredible they are. So what we've seen impacts on carbon emissions. Canada has now become a net source of carbon dioxide because of those forest fires. So as an entire country, they are a net source of their forests are a net source. Our forests in the United States are still a net sink. We do have some individual states. I showed here in Vermont, our forests are a net sink. If you look at some of the Western states, their forests are actually a net source because of forest fires. So it does change that carbon benefit that we get from the forest. We do see forest fires here in Vermont. It's not super common because most of our forests just don't burn that well. They're very moist. And so we do see forest fires. They're pretty much always human caused, right? So we are seeing the conditions that could allow for forest fires increase. So this fall was a good example. We just had a red flag warning a week ago, really windy, super dry, but still warm, right? And all the trees lost their leaves. That's it's when the trees have leafed off and all those leaves are on the ground. That's kind of the perfect conditions. So it's spring and fall. Our springs are usually wet enough that it's okay, but increasingly fall is creating conditions for forest fires. We do have some forests here in Vermont that rely on forest fires for their ecology. So some pine forests and some oak forests, we have historically suppressed those fires. And so there are places where we're intentionally restoring fire in those habitats to bring back some of the characteristics and some of the species, things like that. We call that prescribed burns. They're very well controlled. But there is that weird tension that we've stopped fires in some places for over a century. And so it's created conditions that are now different and even sometimes more fire prone, or sometimes will cause more catastrophic fires. So for the most part, fires in our area just are ground fires and not those big crown fires you see in other places. And it's not that, adding more deadwood, big logs, that's not what burns. It's really the very fine needles and twigs and litter on the forest floor. The state of Vermont has some folks in the Forest Health Department that are they have a wildland fire team, and what they say, yeah, it's the human cause, reducing human cause ignition, and thinking maybe about our defensible space around our buildings. That's where they see, because it's not that our fires are really big or spreading, they're often an acre, 5 acres, 10 acres, and they just smolder. But it's really that we have houses in the forest, and I'm one of those, I live right in the forest. You know, we haven't thought about that like folks have in the West. Metal roofs, keeping, you know, vegetation away from our houses, having, you know, preventing some of those impacts. And we might have to think more about that. That's sort of out of my expertise, but yeah, I mean, you know, fires, even in our forests that don't have frequent fires, there is, you know, historical, you know, record that there would have been fires, but just on really long intervals. And indigenous folks in the region did do prescribed fires a lot to keep areas open, to promote oak regeneration, and blueberries, a lot of species that really like fire, and that was really suppressed in the last 100 years. And so thinking a little bit differently about fire, but problem is the smoke. No one likes the smoke. Yes, I feel like there was a hand over here that I didn't get to. Okay.
Thanks. Can you talk more about the stream?
Yeah.
Development, or you talk, is it leading more biomass there, or letting trees grow, or?
Yeah, so the question is about it's called strategic wood addition, because very careful of that it's strategic. It's like thoughtful. Although trees would naturally fall into streams over time, right? Because trees die, and if they fall this direction, they'll fall into a stream. And so this idea that we have created sort of artificial streams, and that we've often removed, and it's no, you know, we didn't really know, but landowners were even apparently paid to remove trees from streams, or people just wanted to keep things clean. And it's certainly in our bigger waterways, it was more intentional allow for whatever use we had. And so now it's thinking about adding that material back in, and it is really like whole trees, like big stuff, because you don't want to move. And I actually did this work right at undergrad. I was out in Washington State. They did this for salmon habitat, same kind of idea. And we're just kind of doing it here. It has really started for brook trout habitat. And like I said, they found that brook trout are bigger, healthier in these places where they've added wood back in. But I'm also excited about the strategy for all these other things we can layer on, the flood resilience, the carbon. But there is a really good guide that Vermont Fish and Wildlife, pretty technical, but has produced, and like how to do it, and the considerations. And so they're doing it on state land. The Nature Conservancy is doing quite a lot of this work. It's happening in Green Mountain National Forest as well. And so there's a lot of different ways you can do it, you know, making kind of a pile of wood. Some folks, Green Mountain National Forest is just dropping trees and felling them right into the stream versus pulling them with like a come along into place. So people are trying different things and seeing what works. And but it's a pretty cool concept, but there is some momentum for this, and you can get cost share through NRCS, which provides some cost share to landowners. They provide some cost share to do this because of these great benefits to get it done. But yeah.
I have a question again.
I think I just want to take, there was one back here that was.
Well, a really quick question.
Yeah.
You kind of alluded to the answer to this question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. As an expert forester, how do carbon emissions rank in terms of other priorities, given the fact that Vermont's got the lowest emissions of any state in the United States? Vermont's emissions are equivalent to the District of Columbia's emissions, so it's quite small. How do you, as a forester, is this top of your list of priorities? Is it somewhere in the middle? What's most important for you as a forester in relation to Vermont's forest?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of why I package it with the resilience aspect. I certainly think, again, like you know, our forests provide this awesome benefit. It's only really recently that people are caring about it, right? They've done this for time immemorial, like as long as forests have been forests or plants have done this, they have sequestered and stored carbon. So it, you know, one aspect, it's great that there's so much interest, but yes, I have kind of wrapping into the idea that, you know, we need to focus a little bit more holistically on not just looking at this one benefit and how we can capitalize it. Certainly, I do worry about the focus if we just focus on carbon. There's some maladaptive things we could see, right? We're even hearing this about okay, let's grow the fastest growing tree and make some plantations and just put them in, you know, these places where who cares what the wildlife impacts will be, and that stuff has happened around the world, right? Especially because there's money tied to some of this.
So if
yeah.
carbon flux goes to zero, that might not.
If carbon flux goes to zero, as far as our forest,
Because you have lots of them. From a mature forest. In other words, so if we left forests mature.
Yeah.
And carbon flux decreases, then it goes.
Yeah.
Essentially to zero.
Yeah.
You're still getting lots of other benefits.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and that will still take quite a bit of time to get there. But yeah, it's like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, certainly, I think there's like the side that's looking at how to balance out greenhouse gas emissions with the benefits of our forests, and so that's the idea of getting to net zero. So it does take probably, right, we need to couple this with reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, because forests are they're not gonna save us from the climate crisis, and I hope that's, you know, not a shock, but there has been this feeling, I think, of like, you know, oh, we'll plant 1 trillion trees and this will be great, right? And it's really not that simple. And there's other considerations we need to have. Certainly, it's a great, if it helps us keep forests as forests, it helps us think about sustainable stewardship and management. That's awesome, right? So it is a really important value that forests provide us. Yeah, not value. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I'm just wondering, what about all the forests in South America and stuff that are being taken out?
Yeah.
That's affecting the whole world, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, question about like Amazon forest, and yeah, and that's, you know, that's one of those things when we think about, oh, let's not, you know, cut trees here. Well, would our products come from somewhere? We order from Amazon and get boxes, we need furniture, we need houses. You know, we do know that our forests here, we grow really good wood, and it's actually very efficient for us to harvest here. And what I mean by that, and there's been studies that when we go in, we can utilize quite a bit of the wood. So we grow all these great species where we can use red spruce for 2x4s, we can use the, you know, hard maple for flooring, you know, we can like do all these things with the wood, we can get some firewood. When folks go in and harvest in the Amazon, there's a lot of there's not a lot of utility. They're going in for epay, they're going in for these like rare hardwoods, and they have to cut down a lot of trees that they just, yeah. So it's really inefficient. So there's research that has shown like the carbon benefits not harvesting the Amazon are huge. And you also get all this biodiversity and wildlife benefits, and the Amazon does all this great climate regulation. The soils are also really different than the soils here. So once there is no forest there, those soils are really nutrient poor. And they don't allow for continued agriculture and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of a lot of issues with that, and thinking about how, you know, what are the impacts we have. Yeah. Yes.
Do you think the increase in rainfall and precipitation in general, especially since we're getting more rain than snow, is that gonna change species diversity, or certainly it's probably gonna increase size of and rate of growth?
Yeah, so we have seen, I mean, our rainfall has increased about 9 inches.
Yeah.
Since the turn of the century, and quite a lot, it's like 20 something, 21%, 24% in the state, forget exactly. So yeah, we're just seeing more rain, a lot more rain. Generally, like trees like rain. That's not a bad thing, right? Yeah, right, exactly. So that I don't think is gonna inherently be problematic. Where we see it problematic is that we're not seeing that rain come uniformly. We're seeing it more in these heavy rain events. So we get 6 inches, 8 inches, and we have steep terrain, shallow soils. We get a lot of soil erosion. And so that's where I see the big problem. And then we also have of course, a lot of our towns and villages right in the floodplains. Where we can also see an impact, and I've started seeing this, there hasn't been a lot of research to show it's actually increasing, but I'm seeing it anecdotally, is we're getting more foliar fungal diseases on leaves. So like sugar maple in particular, big wide leaves, a lot of fungi just really love being on those leaves, several other species too. So we've seen things like anthracnose was bad this year. They've seen like just discoloration, spottiness. Generally it doesn't kill a leaf or kill a tree, but it makes it not as like the photosynthetic capacity diminishes, and you even see sometimes early leaf drop because the tree realizes that is just a it's not taking in enough carbon to make that leaf worthwhile. And so that happens. That happened, what was it, like how many years ago we had that summer we just got rain all summer. And we saw that it was also a bad foliage season. We had early leaf drop, a lot of foliar fungal diseases. White pine is suffering from this. It's like this native fungus. It's actually several fungi. We call it white pine needle disease. And it's really because our springs have become wetter, and it's causing the needles on the tree to fall in about June, which normally they would fall sort of later in the season around this time. And not all of it's an evergreen tree, so it doesn't drop all of its needles at once, but every few years the needle will drop. And so we've seen that, and we have seen growth declines because of that, and some mortality. And that is a native, folks think it's native fungi, but just the conditions have changed to allow that to sort of proliferate. And so that would be the one thing that, it's not necessarily the rain, but it's like high humidity. Yeah, prolonged humidity that could be a problem, but yeah. Yes.
You mentioned assisted migration
Yeah.
of species. But is there any other conversations happening about the variations between species in terms of their ability to store carbon? Like, is that something that foresters or carbon enthusiasts are thinking about? Or is that just that nuance is so low relative to the forest resilience in general that it doesn't matter?
Folks are looking at, and there is difference, right? Fast growing tree species, they sequester carbon faster. So an aspen, popple, that grows really fast, ash, any species that grows really fast. But trees have different densities of wood, so that can get complicated. So like a sugar maple is very dense wood relative to an aspen. So actually that's gonna translate to more carbon density, and then also longevity, right?
Yeah.
A lot of those fast growing species, and their strategy is grow fast, die young. And so they might live to 70, 80 years old. And so they're not storing carbon for as long as a hemlock is that can grow 600 years old, right? But very slowly. So yes, actually the oldest hemlock in our region has been discovered in the Adirondacks, and it's over 700 years old. Very cool. And likely there are others, we just don't know. But yeah, there are folks that are thinking of it from like the carbon offset world, like can we plant
Especially in
Polania? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Even folks are thinking about breeding or modifying trees to grow fast to sequester and store carbon very shortly. From a forest perspective, that doesn't interest me. I think it's more we want diversity of species, so we want, the benefits of fast growing species are that they are they're usually early successional species that come in light filled gaps, and they might provide different a pin cherry gonna provide soft mass for wildlife. It's gonna provide, it has really nutrient-rich foliage, which helps enrich the soil. So it provides all these other benefits in addition to carbon. And then if you also have some later successional species that are maybe slower growing, then you get that longevity. So I see it as like, we want all species. And so that,
But there's always
Yeah.
trade-offs, right? So like,
absolutely,
I'm thinking in particular, like yellow birch regeneration is super, super poor in Vermont. It's
Yeah.
like completely apparent as soon as you get here. Now we're having a conversation about oak regeneration into the future. Are we giving up on yellow birch, or is that late successional species have its own particular carbon benefit, and of course all those other benefits?
Yeah.
That would be worthwhile to consider.
right.
Because it sounds like a lot of this conversation.
People are definitely managing for yellow birch still.
Yeah.
That is for sure happening.
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
sure, but
so
we should be doing.
People love yellow
For
birch.
sure.
Great for wildlife, good for birds and invertebrates. But yeah, I mean, where I think part of it is recognizing the conditions that each individual species needs to regenerate and the pressures against that regeneration. So
Mhm.
deer browse is huge for yellow birch. I mean, so many places I've seen good yellow birch regeneration and all the stems are gnarled and twisted because they just get eaten all the time by deer. And so they're not gonna amount, they never get above this high. And so we're starting to realize that there's sometimes different things you need to do to get successful regeneration. I would say successful regeneration is the thing probably I worry about the most in our forests, is we have really, good overstory trees. Usually mature trees are fairly resilient. They have trunks that can store water. They have extra reserves of carbohydrates. If they lose their leaves, they usually are okay, but it's having that replacement. And we have bottlenecks for that with so many things that are going on, that just the nature of our forest being very closed canopy, deer browse, earthworms, non-native, and they're in many of our forests, and we know that they impede sugar maple regeneration, things like that. So there's a lot that's working against that regeneration component, and it's sort of been in the background, I think, for probably a while. And unfortunately, like we need years, decades, right? We want to have different cohorts of trees, different ages, and probably something we haven't focused enough on as a state. And we're kind of at this point where like, ooh, I go into these forests and like, great, nothing. And it's not even like you want to have, some not even seedlings or saplings. You want pole-sized trees that are ready to take over for that overstory. So that's where and we do know that those younger trees are the most susceptible to climate impacts too. They just don't have, the reservoirs and the root systems and whatnot. And so that's where we see, when we see climate impacts, we see them there first. Yeah. Yes.
So are any forest advocates trying to work with Fish and Wildlife to get them to change their deer policy? Because they're too
Yeah, so
many.
they actually next year come into effect. There are changes coming in that allow for antlerless, allow for doe hunting up to rifle, which is big. We're the only state that doesn't allow that. So no, they have really, I will say Fish and Wildlife has really listened to folks in the woods that say regeneration is a huge issue. And what I understand too from the deer biologists, it's not that we have an overpopulation of deer, because we don't have that high deer density compared to like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. We don't have enough food for them relative to the deer, right? And so they have to travel so far. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but the number of buds and stems a single mature deer needs to eat, it's like crazy.
4,000 for an average.
There we go. So you can just imagine if they're eating this yellow birch buds here and here and here, they have to eat so many of them, and so they travel really far and wide for that. And so I do really advocate for hunting if folks have deer pressure on their land and they see a lot of deer browse. Letting either hunt yourself, letting folks hunt There is a great tool online, it's like the hunter landowner connection. That the state has, and if you're a landowner, you can say, I wanna open my land to a hunter, reach out to me. For that, which is pretty cool, and they've been doing a lot of mentorship, and they have changed a lot of the regulations. They have different districts now, for wildlife management units around the state. Depending on where there's more deer impacts than others, because the Northeast Kingdom. Really hard winters, don't see a lot of deer issues, deer pressure, compared to some of the lower and more southerly areas.
Like the Connecticut Valley.
Right, yeah, Connecticut Valley, Champlain Valley, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Yep. And they don't like invasive plants, they don't like, there's certain things they do not eat, and so, which is too bad,
They
but.
do if their herds get big enough.
Right, that's how you know they're like not healthy, yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Question
yes.
about, like the management of forests, how human beings manage everything.
Yes.
There's another idea of, like I had cousins in Nigeria who were selling huge amounts of the forest, original forest to IKEA and getting very wealthy, very wealthy.
Huh.
And they said, oh, well, we would plant stuff, and I said, well, it's not the same. So then my sister has another friend who simply just bought a huge area of original forest and just leaves it, doesn't do anything, no studies, nothing, just leave it alone. So there's this idea that you can just buy huge areas of nature and just leave them, don't study it, nothing, just let it be. So I was wondering if like the ideas that we have about managing forests that humans have, are they coming from studying like original forests, like I saw a film that Nancy showed about how the trees are all interconnected under the ground, and they were like ancient forests in Germany, is it? Those original forests in Germany. Anyway, so like these are like original forests from
Yeah.
like hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
And they just,
with the film, I just don't remember where it took place.
yeah, so anyway, yeah, so
So we do have, we call them old growth forests here, United States, and that's just a term that came about in, I don't know, the 60s, 70s. But yes, we do have, people call them primary forests or virgin forests or original forests. We do have some of them here, they're very uncommon, they're really beautiful and great, I like visiting them, I help study them. They are, so that was one of the strategies of like, not only old growth forests, but different areas to have them as reserves to protect them and keep them as they are. That's a great strategy to have, and we do have quite a lot of land in the state that does that, right? We have even nonprofits, Northeast Wilderness Trust, that they buy tracts of land and designate them forever wild. We have wilderness areas on federal land that are similar. We have areas like on state land that are designated to be natural areas. So we do have those kind of places throughout the state. They haven't been, we're recognizing now they don't cover every type of ecosystem, right? But Champlain Valley or Connecticut River Valley has very few of them, right? Where people are in a lot of farmland, we don't have a lot of that. We have them up at high elevation, right? Mount Mansfield, Camel's Hump, places like that. So we're recognizing now like where are the gaps, and to have something of everything that is protected. So we keep everything.
like in the like when man was kind of primitive, man, he observed nature and got his learning from nature. But modern man is a different creature where he's lost his connection like to the moon and stars and everything, like technology. But like the original man was completely in tune with nature, and everything they learned was from nature because there was nothing else. And so that's how they evolved, by watching nature and surviving and learning how to survive alongside with it, as opposed to different idea of like controlling and managing it as a result.
Yeah, okay, yes. Yes, I do use the word like we have the word manage. Sometimes I try to use the word steward, but yes, like that is yeah, right. We don't thinking about us as part of nature rather than as like top down, right? I totally agree with you on that. Yeah. And I think like that's one thing I try to like we need forests more than they need us, right? And so that's really critical to recognize, is like, we are very dependent on what they provide, all these things, clean air, clean water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we owe forests some of this stewardship, and how can we, you know, coexist with them in a better way. But no, I totally, yeah, manage is like, it's a word we have, sometimes it does sound, you know, a little bit,
Corporate.
yeah. Or like too heavy-handed or something, yeah.
I'm concerned about your driving home.
Yes, I am too.
It's like one really
Yeah.
basic question, but we have to let her go, because she's got to drive to Bolton tonight.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Anybody have
Thank
one more
you.
question?
thank you. No, good questions though, very thought provoking.
What causes that weird, like the pine